Kathleen Tran should not have been in that corridor. She should have been asleep, should have been still, should have been the composed maid of an Alpha King who trusted her enough not to question his silence. She was none of those things, and when she pushed open the door to Richard's private chambers, at midnight when she saw him standing in firelight, holding a letter stamped with a crimson wax seal, she didn't recognize she understood, in the cold and certain way that wolves understand danger, that some truths don't wait to be invited in. This one had been waiting a long time. Kathleen never intended to cross the threshold of the Alpha King's private chambers. Not like that. Not at midnight, with rage still hot in her throat and instinct overriding every careful rule she had spent months learning to obey. She never expected to find him like that. Richard Leach, the most feared man in the kingdom, the Alpha whose name silenced council rooms and whose cold gaze had cracked stronger wolves than her standing alone in firelight. Shirt half open, eyes fixed on something in his hands, something he clearly hadn't expected her to see. What she found inside that room would unravel everything she thought she knew about him. It had started with a name. Not a confrontation, not a threat, just a name slipping through the palace corridors the way smoke slips under a door, quiet, invisible, and impossible to ignore once you'd noticed it. Patricia. Kathleen had first heard it 3 days ago, from one of the senior Omegas who'd gone pale the moment she realized she'd said it aloud near the Alpha King's mate. She'd corrected herself quickly, nobody important, of just an old rumor, and changed the subject with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years learning what not to say inside these walls. But Kathleen had heard the hesitation beneath the words. She'd felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She told herself it meant nothing. Patricia was the past. Richard had said so himself, quietly, precisely, in the way he said everything that was meant to be final. There's nothing left there. There was never anything real to begin with. She had believed him. Then she noticed Richard growing distant. Not cold. Richard was always controlled, always measured. But there was a difference between the man who watched her from across a war table with something unreadable and careful in his blue eyes, and the man who had begun slowly to stop watching her at all. He was distracted, somewhere else, and he didn't offer her the reason. Then 2 nights ago the captain of the Eastern Gate mentioned casually, carelessly, that a private courier from the Northern Territories had arrived bearing a letter marked for the king's eyes only. No council seal, no official crest, just a courier who had come after dark and left before dawn. Kathleen told herself that meant nothing too. She was still telling herself that when she found herself in the East Corridor at midnight, her pulse louder than her footsteps, following a feeling she couldn't name and didn't fully trust. She had no real reason to be there. She had every reason. The light under the door of Richard's private quarters was the only warmth in the entire wing, amber and low, like a fire burning on its last patience. It spilled across the stone floor in a thin, urgent line. At this hour, those rooms should have been dark. She didn't knock. She told herself later that she simply forgot. But the truth she'd carry into every moment that came after was that some part of her already knew. Some primal, wolf-deep instinct had pulled her hand to that door and pushed it open before her rational mind could negotiate. What she saw stopped her breath entirely. Richard stood near the hearth, his back half-turned, shirt open at the collar as though he'd undressed for sleep and never finished the thought. In his hands, those steady, merciless hands that had signed war orders and packed sentences without flinching, he held a letter. The seal was already broken. Crimson wax. A crest she didn't recognize but somehow instantly knew. Smoke still curled from the edge of the parchment, as though he'd held it too close to the flame, as though he'd considered letting it burn and then decided, for some reason she couldn't yet name, not to. He heard her. Of course he did. An Alpha King didn't miss footsteps in his own quarters. He turned. And what she saw in Richard Leach's expression in those ice-blue eyes that had never once betrayed uncertainty in all the months she had known him was the last thing she'd expected. Not guilt. Not longing. Fear. Richard. Her voice was steadier than she was. What is that? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her the way he sometimes did in council, measuring, calculating, deciding how much truth the moment could hold. Then quietly he said, "This isn't about love, it's about war." And everything Kathleen thought she understood about their life together, the fragile, hard-won peace they had built inside these walls, began slowly to smoke at the edges. Just like the letter in his hands. The words landed between them like an ember on dry wood. This isn't about love, it's about war. Kathleen didn't move, didn't speak. She stood in the doorway of his chambers with the cold corridor at her back and the firelight pressing against her face, watching him watch her, that careful, measuring look she had learned to read over months of sleeping beside a man who never fully lowered his guard. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Finally, without a word, he held the letter out to her. That, more than anything, frightened her. Richard Leach did not offer explanations easily. He did not hand over evidence of his own vulnerability to anyone. Not his generals, not his council, not the wolves who had bled beside him in 3 wars. He held it out to her, and she took it. The parchment was heavier than it looked. The broken crimson seal caught the firelight as she tilted it toward the flame, and Patricia's handwriting, sharp, deliberate, each letter pressed into the page like a small act of violence, came into focus. Kathleen read it once, then again, slower. I possess the full record of what you ordered at the Battle of Varen's Ridge, the sacrifice of the Coldmoor Pack, the falsified intelligence you approved. The Wolf Council has never seen the original correspondence, but they will, unless you meet my terms. The room felt smaller suddenly. She's blackmailing you. It wasn't a question. She's been building toward it for years. Richard's jaw was tight. The Battle of Varen's Ridge, we received intelligence that the Coldmoor Pack had aligned with enemy rogues. I made a decision based on that report. 37 wolves died because of it. He paused. I believed the intelligence was sound. And now? Now Patricia claims she can prove it was fabricated. His voice dropped to something she had never heard from him before, ragged at the edges, like a blade used too many times. She wants the throne, or she wants to burn it. Kathleen looked back down at the letter. Her eyes traveled to the bottom of the page to a single line she hadn't registered the first time. Her own name, written in Patricia's hand. The girl you choose carries the mark. The girl you choose carries the mark. Kathleen read the line 3 times before she trusted her own voice. What mark? Richard was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man choosing between 2 versions of the truth. Then he moved to the heavy oak desk in the corner and opened the bottom drawer. What he placed on the table between them was old, older than anything she had seen inside these walls. A folded document, its edges worn soft with age, sealed once with wax that had long since crumbled. The Blood Crown Prophecy, he said. It predates my reign by 4 generations. It states that the Alpha King who consolidates power through blood war will be undone by a descendant of the Ashvale line. He paused. Your mother's bloodline. The firelight felt suddenly colder. You knew. The words left her quietly, but they landed hard. Fragments. Rumors. His eyes met hers without flinching. Enough to worry. And your distance these past weeks, not enough to be certain, was never about Patricia. Something shifted in his expression, the controlled mask cracking just enough to show what lived beneath it. I was trying to keep you away from the center of this. If the council connected you to the Ashvale line before I could, you were protecting me. She wasn't sure if it steadied her or undid her further. By shutting me out. I made the wrong choice. His voice was low, certain. I chose you knowing the risk, Kathleen, not because of prophecy, despite it. She wanted to believe him. She was still deciding whether she did when the door burst open. One of Richard's sentinels, breathless, eyes dark with urgency. My king. He swallowed hard. The rogue alphas are gathering. They're riding under Patricia's banner. She arrived at court the way dangerous things often did, quietly and in daylight. No dramatic entrance, no armed escort, just Patricia Voss moving through the great hall like she had never left it, her dark gown fitted and immaculate, her expression carrying the particular calm of someone who had rehearsed every possible reaction to her own arrival and found none of them threatening. Kathleen watched from the upper corridor. Patricia was striking in the way a blade was striking, all clean lines and deliberate angles, nothing wasted, nothing soft. She greeted the council members by name, remembered details, touched an elder alpha's arm when she spoke to him, and held his attention like a woman who had spent years learning exactly how much warmth to perform. In the council chamber she was worse. She never raised her voice, never accused directly, but her questions arrived like needles, precise, angled, drawing just enough blood. The Northern Territories have been restless for 2 seasons now, she observed, her eyes moving briefly to Richard. Strong leadership tends to settle unrest quickly. One wonders what message prolonged patience sends. 2 alphas at the far end of the table shifted in their seats. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Kathleen found Patricia alone in the east corridor afterward. Or perhaps Patricia found her. You've changed him. Patricia studied her with something that wasn't quite contempt, more clinical than that, detached. He hesitates now. He considers. She said the word like it tasted of failure. You softened him. And a soft king is an invitation. An invitation to what? To everyone who has been waiting. Patricia smiled, small, certain, immovable. The kingdom doesn't need a man who feels, Kathleen. It needs one who rules. She left without another word. That evening a folded note appeared beneath Kathleen's chamber door. Come alone. I offer only conversation. She told herself it was strategy. Going alone, saying nothing to Richard, folding Patricia's note into her pocket like a secret she had earned the right to keep. Kathleen told herself it was strength. That meeting Patricia on her own terms, without guards or the shelter of Richard's authority, would prove something important. She understood, approximately 4 minutes after arriving at the designated location, how thoroughly she had been wrong. The meeting point was a narrow courtyard at the edge of the capital's oldest district, abandoned, unlit, smelling of cold stone and something older. Patricia was already there. So there were 6 wolves, Kathleen didn't recognize, positioned with the practiced stillness of men who had been waiting a long time. She didn't even reach for her blade before they had her. The room beneath the fortress was cut from bare rock. A single torch, no windows. The kind of place built specifically so that sound didn't travel upward. Patricia entered without urgency. I want you to understand something before Richard comes for you, she said, settling into the only chair as though it were a throne. Everything that destroyed him I built. The intelligence at Varen's Ridge, The forged correspondence, the council doubts. She paused. I needed him bound to me, dependent on my strategy, my connections, my judgment. Her voice carried no apology, only the flat clarity of someone recounting arithmetic. Then he chose you, and everything I'd constructed began to slip. So this is about losing control, Kathleen said quietly. This is about reclaiming it. The ultimatum was already written. Patricia's messenger was already writing. Richard read it once. The parchment crumpled slowly in his fist. Abdicate before the full council publicly, irrevocably, or your mate dies as proof of what choosing her made you. The fire in the hearth was the only sound in the room. The orders came before dawn. 3 battalions, full mobilization. Burn the rogue territories to the waterline and leave nothing standing that could shelter Patricia's alliance. Richard issued each command with the cold precision of a man who had made peace long ago with what he was capable of. His advisors said nothing at first. They had served him long enough to recognize the particular stillness that preceded his worst decisions. Not rage exactly, but something colder, more total. It was General Harwick who finally spoke. My king, if we raise the northern territories, we hand the council exactly what Patricia promised them. Proof that you rule by destruction. Richard turned from the war table slowly. Harwick didn't step back, to his credit. She has my mate. The words came out quiet, which made them worse. I know. Harwick held his gaze. And Lady Kathleen would know what this costs you. The room went very still. Something moved beneath Richard's skin, the wolf pressing forward, responding to grief the way it always had, with the instinct to destroy everything within reach. His eyes shifted. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop. 2 younger advisors edged toward the door. Then he stopped. Not because the fury left him. It didn't. But because he heard her voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. Steady, certain, spoken in a cell beneath a fortress she hadn't broken in. If you burn them all, you become what she said you are. He stood there for a long moment, breathing. Then he straightened, rolled the mobilization orders into a single cylinder and set them aside. Change of strategy, he said quietly. We don't burn anything. We expose everything. He was already moving toward the door. Prepare to march. They brought him in through the main gate. No battering rams, no fire, just Richard Leach walking through the entrance of Patricia's borrowed fortress like a man who had already decided how the night would end. His warriors at his back and something ancient and controlled burning behind his eyes. The rogue alphas in the courtyard didn't move. They watched. Kathleen was exactly where Patricia wanted, her wrists chained to a stone pillar at the center of the hall, the cold biting at her skin. Patricia stood beside her with a blade held loosely, almost elegantly, the way she did everything. Abdicate, Patricia said. Her voice carried to every corner of the room. Say the words before these witnesses and she walks out breathing. Richard's gaze moved to Kathleen first, a single look assessing, steadying, something beneath the surface of it that had nothing to do with strategy. Then he reached into his coat. Before anyone here pledges anything, he said, I think you should see what your commander built her throne on. The documents passed from hand to hand through the gathered alphas, the original intelligence reports from Varen's Ridge, the forged correspondence beside the authentic versions, Patricia's handwriting on both. The murmuring started low and spread fast. Patricia's grip on the blade tightened. But the alphas closest to her were already stepping back. In the fracture of that moment, Kathleen moved wrenching sideways, using the loosened chain as leverage, pulling free before Patricia could recalibrate. Warriors surged forward. Patricia was seized in seconds. Richard crossed the space between them in 3 strides, his hand closed around Patricia's throat, not squeezing, just there. Richard. Kathleen's voice was quiet beside him. If you do this enraged, she wins. He held still for a long moment. Then slowly he lowered his hand. The tribunal convened at dawn. Every seat in the great council chamber was filled. Pack elders, regional alphas, court officials who had spent years learning to read the room before committing to anything. They sat in careful silence as the evidence was laid before them, piece by piece, with the methodical patience of a man who had decided that truth, presented clearly, was more devastating than any blade. The forged intelligence. The authentic correspondence beside it. The documented chain of Patricia's political maneuvering spanning nearly a decade, allies cultivated, obligations manufactured. A king slowly surrounded by a woman who understood that power wasn't seized, it was constructed. Patricia sat through all of it without flinching. To the end, she was composed. It was Elder Casson who raised the prophecy. He did it quietly, almost apologetically, but the intent was precise. His eyes moving to Kathleen as he recited the old text. The blood crown falls to the ashvale line. A murmur moved through the chamber like wind through dry grass. Kathleen felt every gaze in the room find her. She stood. "I've heard the prophecy," she said. Her voice was steady, not loud, not performed, simply certain. "And I'll tell you what it means." She held the room without apology. "I am not his downfall. I am his balance. The version of Richard Leach this kingdom fears is the one that ruled alone. The one standing before you now chose justice over massacre, law over rage, truth over convenience." She paused. "That is not weakness. That's what a kingdom is built to last on." The silence that followed was the kind that meant something had shifted. The council voted. Patricia was stripped of every title she had accumulated across 20 years of careful construction. Exiled under armed guard. No execution. Richard had been explicit on that point. Not vengeance. The kingdom watched and understood the difference. He was waiting for her in his chambers. The same room where it had all begun, the firelight, the heavy silence, the space between them charged with everything that hadn't yet been said. But the letter was gone. The smoke was gone. The particular tension that had lived in these walls for weeks had burned itself out, leaving something quieter in its place. Richard was standing near the hearth when she entered. He turned when he heard her footsteps. Then without a word he knelt. Not the practiced deference of a king performing ceremony, something underneath that a man setting down the weight of a crown for just long enough to speak without it. "I have ruled this kingdom through fear, through strategy, through decisions I will spend the rest of my life carrying." His voice was low, unhurried. "I thought that was all I was built for." He looked up at her. "You made me want to be wrong about that." He reached into his coat and held up the Luna bond cord, simple, ancient, more binding than any political alliance Patricia had ever constructed. "I would burn kingdoms for you," he said, "but I would rather build one with you." Kathleen took his hand and pulled him to his feet. The ceremony happened under moonlight before the entire pack. No secrecy, no shadows, no former lover lingering in the silence between them. Richard marked her as his equal mate before every witness the kingdom could gather, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the same certainty he used to issue war commands. Except this time, what he was declaring was something he had chosen entirely for himself. The prophecy, someone noted afterward, had always been misread. It was never about ending his reign. It was about ending the version of him ruled by fear. Inside his chambers later, the fire burned clean and steady. No smoke. No secrets. Only the quiet, unguarded sound of two people who had walked through the worst of things and come out the other side still choosing each other.